Hello guys and welcome back to Counter 10. My name is Annie and on today's episode we're going to finish off our series of equipment and safety with our last topic, which is mainly going to focus in on ultrasound, but at the end a little bit about the new depth of anesthesia monitors that are coming out, particularly Z-Line. I've purposely saved this topic as our last episode in our series because for me I always found ultrasounds a very challenging topic. And it's one of those SAQs that I wish never came up when I was sitting the written exam. So I'm going to try to do my best to explain to you ultrasound in a way that makes sense to me, which might be a dumbed down version, but hopefully makes sense to you as well. Now, just before we get started, I want to say a huge congratulations to all the candidates that sat their Viva recently. Regardless of the results you get, you should be immensely proud of the effort that you put in, and it's a huge accomplishment to go through this exam regardless of whether you pass or fail. So well done everyone who recently sat, and with that said, let's dive straight into it.
1, 2, 3, 4.
The first learning objective today is describe the principles of ultrasound imaging. An ultrasound is a device which produces sound waves that are high frequency, greater than 20 kHz, which are inaudible to the normal hearing range. With medical ultrasounds, the frequencies produced are extremely high, typically 1 MHz all the way up to now 15 MHz on the new ultrasound probes you might see around your hospital. The way this ultrasound is produced relies primarily on the knowledge of the piezoelectric effect. Within the ultrasound probe, there are small crystals known as piezoelectric crystals which have unique property that if you apply a pressure to them, they deform and change shape and they can produce a voltage. This can either work to produce a sound wave or can be used to produce a voltage. Within an ultrasound probe, what happens is we layer this probe with multiple piezoelectric crystals, roughly in the realms of hundreds to thousands. We apply a small voltage to these crystals, causing them to deform and release energy in the sound of a mechanical pressure wave, aka a sound wave. That sound wave then travels across different tissue mediums and then returns back to those same piezoelectric crystals, causing them to deform and this time release a voltage which the ultrasound machine interprets as an image. That's the crux of ultrasound image generation. Within this process, there are lots of little steps which we need to understand at a higher level so we know exactly how that image is being produced. Starting off with the sound wave itself that is produced, each sound wave has its own characteristic. A sound wave can be characterized by either its wavelength, its frequency, or the velocity that it travels through a medium. And generally within tissues, the average velocity is roughly around about 1500 meters a second. So really, the two things we can modify with an ultrasound wave is either changing its frequency or its wavelength, and these things are inversely related. As that sound wave propagates through a medium, the sound wave naturally loses energy, which we refer to as attenuation. Attenuation can be thought of as a concept which is similar to damping when we talked about an arterial line. But instead, with attenuation relating to ultrasound, there are 4 key factors which lead to attenuation. The first key factor and the major factor of attenuation is reflection of that ultrasound wave. Reflection of an ultrasound wave describes the ultrasound wave hitting a tissue medium and returning directly back to the probe itself. And we require reflection to occur because without that ultrasound wave coming back to the transducer, we would have no image on our ultrasound screen. So reflection is key and the most important factor when it comes to generating an ultrasound image on your screen. The other 3 factors of attenuation all do not lead to generation of an ultrasound image. Rather, they lead to loss of that ultrasound wave. This can either be refraction of that ultrasound wave. So as that wave hits another tissue medium, it bends like light bending through a prism. It can either scatter, so that ultrasound wave dissipates in multiple different directions, none of which return back to the ultrasound probe, or the ultrasound wave itself can just be absorbed by the tissue and lost as heat. So when you think about attenuation, think about it as the concept of the ultrasound wave losing energy, but also it is important because it provides reflection, and without reflection, we would have no ability to generate an image. This then leads us on to talking about how the ultrasound actually makes the image that you see on the screen. And for this, you have to recognize that the ultrasound can only detect a few variables. The information it can gather is 1, how long did it take for that ultrasound wave to return back to me, i.e. the probe, and 2, what is the strength of the wave that is returning back to me. Based on these characteristics, the ultrasound can then develop an image which gives you depth and brightness. So by knowing and calculating these two values, the ultrasound can start to build an image which shows different structures at different depths and different brightness or echogenicities of different structures. And this is what we refer to as a B-mode image, or our basic image that we have with any ultrasound machine. Now let's take this understanding of image generation to the next level by introducing a concept of acoustic impedance. Acoustic impedance refers to the property of any physical tissue that dictates how sound wave travels through it. And the main property that dictates how sound wave travels through a tissue is generally the density of that tissue. So each tissue in our body can be labeled with its own acoustic impedance. And acoustic impedance can be calculated with the equation the density of that substance times the speed of the sound in that substance. In Mac 95, there's a great table which lists the acoustic impedance for different tissues within our body. This includes muscles, fat, blood, water, bone, and air. And what's important to realize is not what the acoustic impedance of that tissue is, but at the boundary between two different substances where the ultrasound wave is propagating through, the difference between acoustic impedances is what determines how much of the sound wave is reflected back versus how much of the sound wave propagates through. And the bigger the acoustic impedance difference between the two substances at its boundary, the higher the amount of reflection back to the ultrasound probe. And we can apply this knowledge in 3 distinct examples. The first example is the ultrasound probe floating in air. Air has an extremely low density, and therefore the acoustic impedance of air is essentially close to 0. This leads to a huge difference between acoustic impedances where any one boundary is air. And that's why we refer to air being the enemy with an ultrasound probe. This is also the reason why you need to put gel on your ultrasound probe, is to get rid of air as the medium so we can actually generate an image when we place that ultrasound probe on the patient. Example 2 is the ultrasound probe going through structures which are water-filled, blood-filled, or fluid-filled. The acoustic impedance of these compartments is relatively constant, and on the borders of these structures, you have a difference in acoustic impedance, and a small portion of the ultrasound wave is reflected back. However, within these structures, they don't have a high degree of attenuation, so the ultrasound wave can just propagate through without losing much of its energy until it's out of that structure, and part of that ultrasound wave is then reflected back again. This allows us to figure out where is that posterior wall of that vein that we're trying to cannulate. The third example is when we have structures with really high acoustic impedances. This is classically bone. What this shows up as on our screen is a bright hyperechoic structure, and that's due to the fact that when that ultrasound beam hits that structure, almost all of it is reflected back, leading to an increase in strength of signal returning back to the probe, and very little of that wave propagates past that tissue, and therefore we cannot identify structures that lie beneath it. So, in summary, with these three examples of acoustic impedance, when we talk about acoustic impedance, we're referring to the individual physical property of that tissue, which is based on that tissue's density and the speed the sound wave travels through that tissue. For us to generate an image, what we're actually interested in is the acoustic impedance mismatch that happens at the boundary of two different tissues. The greater the mismatch, the greater the degree of reflection, and the greater the degree of image generation, which allows us to delineate on our ultrasound image what we think those structures are. So classically, anything that's fluid-filled would be black, anything that's muscle or fat would be hypoechoic, and anything that's bone would be hyperechoic. And the caveat to this is that anything in our body that is air would also be black because its acoustic impedance mismatch is so high. That's why you can't really ultrasound lung alveoli because they're full of air, or inside a bowel which is full of air as well. And again, on Mach 95, there's a beautiful table which shows the percentage of reflection that you get based on the boundary of different tissue types. Examples being muscle and fat, where you get 1% reflection, versus something like soft tissue and air, where you get 99.9% reflection. Finally, the last thing to touch on with regards to image generation is the variable of ultrasound frequency and wavelength. We've touched on this at the start by saying that the ultrasound wave can only be modified in its frequency and wavelength, which are inversely related. And following this has some implications on image generation. The most simplest explanation is that lower frequency ultrasound waves have greater tissue penetration for deeper structures, while higher frequency ultrasound waves have greater penetration for superficial structures. And this all relates to how that ultrasound wave attenuates and loses energy over time. If you think about it as an example, when you have a neighbor on your street who is having a house party, what is the part of the music that's playing loudly that you can hear? It's typically the bass that resonates while everything else is lost. This is the same principle because low frequency sound waves penetrate further versus high frequency sound waves. And to apply this in the ultrasound setting, we can then base our probe selection on what we want to target. If it's a superficial structure, such as for IV cannulation or arterial cannulation, a linear probe is the probe of choice, while for deeper structures like doing a fast scan, a curvilinear probe with a wider surface area and a lower frequency is your probe of choice for those deeper structures. And if you choose the wrong probe, there are some cheats you can use within your ultrasound machine to optimize imaging. The classic setting that you might be aware of is gain. And gain is essentially turning up the return signal of those ultrasound waves coming back and being reflected to the probe so that everything on your screen looks brighter. This allows you to temporarily see deeper structures, but at the cost, you may lose the ability to delineate between structures. With your settings as well, you can change where you want to optimize your ultrasound depth penetration. You can change the field of that ultrasound view to make it narrower or bigger, and you can either focus in or out at an ultrasound image to improve the clarity of the thing you're trying to look at. All of these have their upsides and downsides, and it's beyond the primary content, but it's important to know from a clinical perspective how you can modify the ultrasound despite maybe limited probe selection to give you the best image to succeed at whatever procedure you're doing. This then moves us on to look at the second learning objective for today, which is describe the physics of ultrasound imaging and the use of Doppler. Doppler is a mode of ultrasound imaging, just like B mode, which we spoke about, which used time and strength of the reflection to generate an image. Another mode you might see on your ultrasound machine is M mode. And briefly, M mode captures the movement of a tissue across a single scan line. And if you're concentrating all the piezoelectric crystals across a single scan line, you can generate a really detailed image which can show even the fine granular movements. That image is scaled across time, where time is the x-axis and the image itself is a y-axis. And these modes are really useful when we're trying to look at specific structures in small details, like when we do lung ultrasounds or when we do cardiac ultrasounds, either looking at the valves or even looking at the thicknesses of the ventricles, which allows us to get outputs like fractional shortening. And while that's really useful, the big negative of M mode is because of that single scan line, you don't get that global image. So each one of these modes has its own role to play. And with that, going back to Doppler mode, to understand Doppler mode, we first have to understand the Doppler effect. You might be familiar with the Doppler effect as the effect that we refer to when we hear an ambulance coming or hear a train on the platform. What it describes is the change in the observed frequency when a wave is reflected off a moving object relative to the position of the receiver. Now, to break that definition down, we just have to understand some simple facts, which is that sound travels in a medium at a constant speed. And if we say the velocity is constant, then the Doppler effect only exists because there's a change in either frequency or wavelength. And what happens is that if sound is traveling towards an object, which is the receiver, the frequency of that sound wave increases and the wavelength decreases. And this is reflected in your ears as a higher pitch as that sound wave comes closer to you. And as that sound wave then travels away from you, you get a decrease in frequency and an increase in wavelength, which leads to a lower pitch that you hear. And knowing that the frequency and the wavelength change relative to the receiver, we can then manipulate that within the ultrasound to give us information. Specifically with Doppler mode, we can use the change in frequency of blood traveling across the ultrasound beam to figure out 1, which way the blood is moving, and this is referred to as color flow Doppler, and 2, to do higher level calculations such as figuring out cardiac output, quantifying valvular disease, and the basis of all these calculations comes from an equation which we refer to as the Doppler shift equation. And there's many ways to write this equation depending on what you're trying to figure it out for. If you're trying to work it out for cardiac output, you can say that the velocity of the object is equal to the change in frequency from emission to detection times the speed of sound divided by 2 times the emitted frequency, because you account for the round trip there and back, times the cos theta angle, which is the angle of incident at which the ultrasound beam hits the relative object in question. And from this equation, you can hopefully see that the angle that the ultrasound beam hits the object in question is a really important player in giving us an accurate number, because within this equation, that number is represented by the cos theta angle. So ideally you want that cos theta angle to be directly parallel, because a cos theta of 0 gives you 1. And if that angle is at 90 degrees, that will give you a cos theta angle of 0, which will be a completely inaccurate number when it comes to measuring things like the cardiac output. And because there's this range from 0 degrees to 90 degrees, depending on what text you read, they say that the acceptable angle of incidence is sometimes within 30 degrees or 60 degrees. And we'll talk a bit more about this Doppler shift equation when we review one of the specific past SAQs that looks at measuring cardiac output. Going back to why Doppler mode is also useful in telling us if blood is either moving towards the probe or away from the probe, this allows us with the color Doppler mode to figure out the direction of blood. And the simple acronym to remember is BART, which refers to the color blue moving away from the ultrasound probe and red towards the ultrasound probe. So red and blue on color Doppler ultrasound don't refer to arterial or venous, but rather the direction of blood flow relative to the ultrasound probe. So with that, we've finished looking at ultrasounds with both reviewing some basic principles and then the physics behind ultrasound imaging and the use of Doppler. And really, you can go on a huge deep dive on ultrasound on Mac 95, which has an amazing related concepts, online and on YouTube, and really get into the minutiae of ultrasounds, like understanding things like reverberation artifacts. But I think that level of knowledge is great clinically, but you don't really need it for the Part 1 exam. So then the last thing I want to do before we move on to the SAQs is look at one other topic, which was depth of anesthesia monitoring, and specifically focus in on Z-line. We've already covered depth of anesthesia monitoring, in particular BIS, when I did my neurophysiology series on the episode of sleep and EEG. But over the last 12 months, there have been new devices that are becoming readily available, like the Masimo Z-line, that I do think will become the standard of practice when it comes to neuromonitoring along with NIRS for any patient having any procedure in the near future. And so it should be, because these tools increase safety and I do think will have an impact on patient outcome. So with that little justification, let's review Z-line really quickly. Z-line is simply put what we see in BIS but taken to another level. While on BIS, we get a single EEG trace, which is a processed EEG made with Fourier's transformation and multiple time domain analyses alongside a dimensionless number from 0 to 100 with some secondary outputs such as EMG, signal quality index, and spectral edge frequency. Z-line is a monitor that takes those concepts and expands on them by adding on a density spectral array, aka a DSA. On the display window, you have 3 distinct areas which show the information which is captured by 4 probes, 2 left electrodes and 2 right electrodes. From this, on the top, you see the raw EEG being displayed. You have the middle section which displays its own version of a dimensionless index referred to as a patient state index, also going from 0 to 100, where instead with BIS, the optimal anesthetic range is between 40 to 60, with the patient state index, or the PSI, the optimum number is between 25 to 50 for adequate depth of anesthesia. You still get the additional outputs of EMG, suppression ratio, as well as the spectral edge frequency of the left side and the right side electrodes, along with any artifact percentage which makes up the signal that the Z-line is capturing. But really, why I wanted to touch on this piece of equipment is because of the addition of the DSA. What the DSA does is display a power and frequency analysis over a time course of 20 minutes. And it's doing this frequency analysis by breaking down the waveforms into higher power waveforms and lower power waveforms, and these are displayed as colors that you see on the screen, where the higher power colors have a warmer color and the lower power waveforms have a cooler color associated with them. Within this DSA, the frequency powered analysis repeated close to every second to increase accuracy, and what this then spits out, you get a white line trend which displays the spectral edge frequency both for the left and right hand sides, and remembering that the spectral edge frequency describes where 95% of the power lies within the waves. So at what frequency are 95% of the waves captured at? And by displaying both the trends for the left hand side and right hand side, you can see whether there is symmetry between the different hemispheres or asymmetry, which might allude you to earlier detection in problems in oxygen delivery and supply to the brain. Additionally, on this DSA, you can also see the representation of burst suppression as singular vertical black lines which stands out across that color scheme. So putting that together, when it comes to interpreting the Z line, the advantages of using this to ensure depth of anesthesia is that alongside your patient state index number, you also have this density spectral array, which can either reaffirm what you're seeing or give you red flag signs that something might not be right. And for the Part 1 exam specifically, I can easily see how a picture of a DSA could end up on an MCQ, and there hasn't been any SAQs asking about this, but just like the first SAQ that ever asked about BIS, I can easily imagine that for future exams, this question is not far away from being asked. And with that, we come to the end of our learning objectives and move on at looking at the previous SAQs, which were really just focused on asking about ultrasound. The first question we're going to look at was asked in 2025 second sitting, which was, explain the physical properties by which an ultrasound can generate a two-dimensional image. They specifically said, do not include Doppler, and this question has now been repeated 4 times in total, with the last time it was asked having a pass rate of 51%. This question is essentially asking us to summarize what we discussed in our first learning objective today in a more succinct fashion. And for this, I think the examiner report attached to this question actually has a really nice layout that we can use to make our model answer. Within this examiner report, they've stated that the key domains are 1. Ultrasound transducer properties and the clinically used range of transducers. 2. Physics of ultrasound, including generation and detection of an ultrasound. And then 3. The interaction of the ultrasound beam with tissues and waves traveling through tissues, and how returning waves are used in image generation, with the added part for time for and intensity of the returning signal used in image generation. You could easily get extra marks by adding in clinical applications, whether this is about transducer selection, the physics of ultrasound in image generation, or further elaboration of ultrasound wave tissue interactions, and these don't take that long to incorporate to make your answer from a 1 to 2 to a 3 to a 4. So based on everything we've covered today, my model answer for this question would start off with a basic definition of an ultrasound, being the generation of a sound wave above the audible hearing range of greater than 20 kHz. For medical purposes, ultrasound waves are between 1 to 15 MHz. Following this, I would have a small section on the transducer properties, starting off with transducer types, broken down into linear, phased array, and curvilinear, and with these, their associated megahertz, with the linear having the highest megahertz, while the curvilinear has the lowest megahertz, but also has a wide surface area, which allows for a greater image capture, therefore used for structures like abdominal and obstetric scans. Putting this in here already adds in that extra clinical application early into your answer. Then with the other transducer properties, I would simply speak about that the probe within it has a backing material, the piezoelectric crystals, an acoustic matching layer, and an acoustic lens. If you had time, you can add in the main aim of these features is just to ensure that the beam of ultrasound is focused towards its target and it prevents attenuation of that sound wave. From there on, I would move on to my next heading, which is the physics of ultrasound image generation and detection. And for this, I would start off with the ultrasound wave is generated through a voltage that is applied to the piezoelectric crystals, which creates a change in these crystals, releasing a mechanical pressure wave, aka a sound wave. Additionally, I would add on that these sound waves are produced hundreds to thousands of times a second, and that this allows for better image generation and detection of the ultrasound waves. This phenomenon of creating sound waves is referred to as a piezoelectric effect, and you'd put that somewhere in this answer. From there, my next heading would be, what happens to the sound wave after it's generated? And here I would put that the ultrasound wave goes through attenuation, and that attenuation is caused by 4 factors. This is either reflection, refraction, scattering, or absorption. And then out of these, reflection is the only form of attenuation which allows for image generation. Then my next heading would be image quality generation. This is divided into two characteristics. First, the characteristic of the sound wave, and second, the degree of reflection. With regards to the characteristic of the sound wave, the two characteristics we spoke about were the time taken for the sound wave image to return to the probe and the strength of that sound wave returning to the probe. These two characteristics determine the image location and the echogenicity of the image that is being scanned, and that's what we see in our classic B mode. With regards to the degree of reflection, this is mainly determined by the acoustic impedance of a substance. And here I would have the definition of acoustic impedance as equaling the density of an object and the speed of sound through that object. Then my next line would be, the degree of reflection is determined by the difference in acoustic impedance at the boundary of two different substances, aka tissues, where a larger difference leads to an increased amount of reflection. And this is when we can go into the examples of different tissues having different acoustic impedances. The two classic ones I would write down here are air. So to allow imaging, we need to have a medium with a similar acoustic impedance, which is why we use a gel as a coupler to allow image generation. The second example of a high acoustic impedance mismatch is the presence of bone, and this leads to a high degree of reflection, and therefore on image generation comes up as a hyperechoic structure. However, the downside is that the ultrasound wave cannot propagate past that, and therefore structures beneath bone cannot be visualized under ultrasound. Then finally, I would have my last section, which would be titled Clinical Application and Optimization of Image. For this, we can talk about how high frequency probes have poor penetration of deeper structures, while low frequency probes have greater penetration of deeper structures, and this is all based on the inverse relationship between frequency and wavelength. Therefore, clinically, a linear probe is a better ultrasound probe for things like ultrasound and arterial cannulation. Additionally, you can add in here that an image can be optimized by modifying where the probe focuses its energy on, so adjusting what kind of frequency waves you want the probe to send out, but also by adjusting the gain, which increases the amount of reflection interpreted by the probe, leads to a brighter image, but at the compromise of being able to delineate different types of structures. The last thing I would put in with clinical application, if you had time, is that by understanding what happens at different tissue boundaries, such as the pleura and the parenchymal lung, we can use this knowledge to identify certain clinical states. And the example here is seeing the pleura sliding across the lung when the lung is inflated, and when you have a pneumothorax, the pleura would not be sliding. But the only reason we know that's the pleura, you have the air, which because of its high acoustic impedance mismatch with the pleural tissue, leads to it being an anechoic area, therefore black on our image, so we know that that border must be the border between the pleura and the aerated lung beneath it. And if you're still really struggling to come up with your own model answer for this question, I think the best reference here is the Amanda Diaz model answer, which is only 1 page long, but I think it just hits the key points that you need to absolutely put in to get your bare minimum 2/3 for this answer. Then finally for today, we have the question that was asked in 2023 second sitting, which was briefly outline the principles of measuring cardiac output using Doppler ultrasound. This had been asked previously before, but this was way back in 2005, and this time had a pass rate of 34%. The examiner report here mentioned that the key domains was firstly, how velocity is measured using Doppler, and secondly, processing a pulsatile velocity signal to obtain cardiac output. Within both of these points, they said that it was possible to pass without reproducing the Doppler equation if correct understanding was otherwise shown, and that if you just wrote down the Doppler equation without explanation, that itself was not sufficient. Additionally, you could get extra marks if you had information about how ultrasound waves are generated. details about velocity measurement, and then discussing errors or assumptions with clinical measurement techniques. So to answer this question, when I think of my model answer, I interpret this question as having two different parts to it. There's the part of cardiac output, and then there's the Doppler effect part. So for both these parts, I have a separate definition. And for cardiac output, you know the definition is heart rate times stroke volume. And within this, you can say that the heart rate can be calculated clinically using ECG or by visualization of the heart on TTE ultrasound. With regards to Doppler ultrasound, this refers to a specific mode of ultrasound which relies on the understanding of the Doppler effect. My simple exam definition of the Doppler effect was a change in sound frequency of a moving object relative to the observer, adding in that as the sound moves towards the observer, this leads to a higher frequency pitch, and when the sound moves away from the observer, this leads to a lower frequency pitch. This is due to a change in frequency and wavelength because velocity of sound remains a constant. Then you can go on to how Doppler ultrasound works because it needs that fundamental principle that frequency changes of a moving object relative to the observer, and in this case, the observer is the ultrasound probe, and the thing that's moving is generally what we're measuring, which is the blood velocity. So to quantify that, we then have the Doppler equation, which can be rearranged to figure out the velocity of the object, being the velocity of blood. We can say that it's equal to the change in frequency from emission to detection of the ultrasound beam, the speed of sound, which is roughly 1500 meters per second within tissues, divided by 2 times the round trip of the ultrasound wave times the initial emitted frequency, and that is then multiplied by the incident angle, which is derived by cos theta. To show your understanding of this equation, I would just write in here the biggest determinant for accuracy of accurate velocities is 1, the incident angle, where if an ultrasound beam is completely parallel, that leads to the highest accuracy, and if an ultrasound beam is perpendicular, so therefore at a 90-degree angle, that leads to the worst accuracy. The other main factor is where the ultrasound beam is focused, and for this, you need to focus in your Doppler in the accurate region of what you want to measure. And for cardiac output, where you want to measure it is at the left ventricular outflow tract. And this will then let you go on to how you can use Doppler to measure cardiac output. So we've already mentioned how we're going to figure out heart rate. Now we need to figure out how we're going to measure stroke volume. And stroke volume is measured in mils, and there's no one method on ultrasound which allows us to straight away get a volume. To get a volume on ultrasound, we need to have two things. We need to have an area and we need to have a velocity. And we can calculate both of these things on basic ultrasound. So to calculate area, the area of question is the left ventricular outflow tract. And for this, we can acquire the image in the parasternal long axis view of the heart, which gives us a great view of the left ventricular outflow tract. And on your classic B mode, we can freeze the image on our ultrasound, and at the point of mid-systole, this actually gives us the diameter of that left ventricular outflow tract. And with basic high school maths, we can convert that diameter into an area using pi times r squared. So now we have the first component of our equation, which is the LVOT area. We now need the second component, which is the velocity of that blood flow in that LVOT area. And this is where Doppler comes into use. Remember, we've said in our question, the caveat to accuracy is ensuring alignment and a decrease in incident angle and measuring the thing we want to measure. So to get the thing we want to measure, we'd say we want a 5-chamber apical view of the heart where we focus in our Doppler at the LVOT. And a focused in Doppler is referred to as a pulsed wave Doppler. This is similar to thinking about the M mode, where an M mode has a single scan line, and therefore you're concentrating that energy in a specific area. A pulsed wave Doppler is also focusing that ultrasound energy into a specific area, which allows it to spit out a velocity in that area that you focused in on. And that velocity is referred to as the VTI, which is the velocity time integral. And now we have the velocity and we have the area. So if we times the velocity by the area, we then have the stroke volume. And by timesing that by heart rate, we now get a cardiac output. To finish off this question, you could then talk about the possible disadvantages and advantages of measuring cardiac output in this format. And the biggest disadvantage would be that it requires a special probe. So classically, your phased array echo probe. It requires training to do, so it's operator dependent. It takes on some assumptions based on what your incident angle is of your Doppler. And if you just do this calculation once, it might not be an accurate representation of the cardiac output. So you can increase the accuracy by repeating these measurements 3 to 5 times to ensure that you're actually representing the patient's cardiac output. The other advantage of this technique is that it's non-invasive to the patient, which I think is a really important thing to put into your answer. So that brings us to the end of our episode today and to the end of our equipment and safety series. Like I said at the start, by no means am I an expert at equipment. It was actually one of those topics I really didn't like, but hopefully this has given you a better understanding of some of the core concepts when it comes to the key equipment that we use every day in our operating theatre. I'm not sure what our next series will be, so if there's something you really want me to cover, send me an email and maybe I can go through it in our next series. Thanks again for listening and best of luck with your studying, and I'll catch you guys next time on Counter 10.